For data sourcing, the first thing we want to talk about is measurement. And within that category, we're going to talk about metrics. The idea here is that you actually need to know what your target is if you want to have a chance to hit it. There's a few particular reasons for this. First off, data science is action oriented. The goal is to do something as opposed to simply understand something, which I say as an academic practitioner. Also, your goal needs to be explicit, and that's important because the goals can guide your effort. So you want to say exactly what you're trying to accomplish so you know when you get there. Also, goals exist for the benefit of the client because they can prevent frustration. They know what you're working on. They know what you have to do to get there. And finally, the goals and the metrics exist for the benefit of the analyst because they help you use your time well. You know when you're done, you know when you can move ahead with something, and that makes everything a little more efficient and a little more productive. Now, when we talk about this, the first thing you want to do is try to define success in your particular project or domain. Depending on where you are in commerce, that can include things like sales or click-through rates or new customers. In education, it can include scores on tests. It can include graduation rates or retention. In government, it can include things like housing and jobs. In research, it can include the ability to serve the people that you're trying to better understand. So whatever domain you're in, there will be different standards for success, and you're going to need to know what applies in your domain. Next are specific metrics or ways of measuring. Now, again, there are a few different categories here. There are business metrics. There are key performance indicators or KPIs. There are SMART goals. That's an acronym. And there's also the issue of having multiple goals. I'll talk about each of those for just a second now. First off, let's talk about business metrics. If you're in the commercial world, there are some common ways of measuring success. A very obvious one is sales revenue. Are you making more money? Are you moving the merchandise? Are you getting sales? Also, there's the issue of leads generated, new customers or new potential customers, because that then in turn is associated with future sales. There's also the issue of customer value or lifetime customer value. So you may have a small number of customers, but they all have a lot of revenue. And you can use that to really predict the overall profitability of your current system. And then there's churn rate, which has to do with, losing and gaining new customers and having a lot of turnover. So any of these are potential ways of defining success and measuring it. These are potential metrics. There are others, but these are some really common ones. Now, I mentioned earlier something called a key performance indicator or KPI. KPIs come from David Parmenter, and he's got a few ways of describing them. He says a key performance indicator for business, number one, should be non-financial. So not just the bottom line, but something else that might be associated with it or that measures the overall productivity of the association. They should be timely, for instance, weekly, daily, or even constantly gathered information. They should have a CEO focus. So the senior management team are the ones who generally make the decisions that affect how the organization acts on the KPIs. They should be simple. So everybody in the organization, everybody knows what they are and knows what to do about them. They should be team-based. So teams can take joint responsibility for meeting each one of the KPIs. They should have significant impact. What that really means is they should affect more than one important outcome. So you can do profitability and market reach, or improved manufacturing time and fewer defects. And finally, an ideal KPI has a limited dark side. That means there's fewer possibilities for reinforcing the wrong behaviors and rewarding people for sort of exploiting the system. Next, there are SMART goals, where SMART stands for specific, measurable, assignable to a particular person, realistic, meaning you can actually do it with the resources you have at hand, and time bound, so you know when it can get done. So whenever you form a goal, you should try to assess it on each of these criteria. And that's a way of saying that this is a good goal to be used as a metric for the success of our organization. Now, the trick, however, is when you have multiple goals, multiple possible endpoints. And the reason that's difficult is because, well, it's easy to focus on one goal if you're just trying to maximize revenue, or if you're just trying to maximize, graduation rate. There's a lot of things you can do. It becomes more difficult when you have to focus on many things simultaneously, especially because some of these goals may conflict. The things that you do to maximize one may impair the other. And so when that happens, you actually need to start engaging in a deliberate process of optimization. You need to optimize. And there are ways that you can do this. If you have enough data, you can do mathematical optimization to find the ideal balance of efforts to pursue one goal and the other goal at the same time. Now, this is a very general summary, and let me finish with this. In sum, metrics or methods for measuring can help awareness of how well your organization is functioning and how well you're reaching your goals. There are many different methods available for defining success and measuring progress towards those things. The trick, however, comes when you have to balance efforts to reach multiple goals simultaneously, which can bring in the need for things like optimization. When talking about data sourcing and measurement, one very important issue has to do with the accuracy of your measurements. The idea here is that you don't want to have to throw away all your ideas. You don't want to waste effort. One way of doing this in a very quantitative fashion is to make a classification table. So what that looks like is this. You talk about, for instance, positive results, negative results, and in fact, let's start by looking at the top here. The middle two columns here talk about whether an event is present, whether your house is on fire, whether a sale occurs, whether you've got a tax evader, whatever. So that's whether a particular thing is actually happening or not. On the left here is whether the test or the indicator suggests that a thing is or is not happening. And then you have these combinations of true positives, where the test says it's happening and it really is, and false positive, where the test says it's happening, but it's not. And then below that, true negatives, where the test says it isn't happening, and that's correct. And then false negatives, where the test says there's nothing going on, but there is in fact the event occurring. And then you start to get the column totals, the total number of events present or absent, and the row totals that talk about the test results. Now, from this table, what you get is 4 kinds of accuracy, or really 4 different ways of quantifying accuracy using different standards. And they go by these names: sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, and negative predictive value. I'll show you very briefly how each of them works. Sensitivity can be expressed this way. If there's a fire, does the alarm ring? You want that to happen. And so that's a matter of looking at the true positives and dividing that by the total number of alarms. So the test positive means there's an alarm, and the event present means there's a fire. You want always to have an alarm when there's a fire. Specificity, on the other hand, is sort of the flip side of this. If there isn't a fire, does the alarm stay quiet? This is where you're looking at the ratio of true negatives to total absent events, where there's no fire and the alarm's not ringing, and that's what you want. Now, those are looking at columns. You can also go sideways across rows. So the first one there is positive predictive value, often just abbreviated as PPV. And we flip around the order a little bit. This one says, if the alarm rings, was there a fire? So now you're looking at the true positives and dividing it by the total number of positives. Total number of positives is any time the alarm rings. True positives is because there was a fire. And negative predictive value, or NPV, says, if the alarm doesn't ring, does that in fact mean that there is no fire? Well, here you're looking at true negatives and dividing it by total negatives, the time that it doesn't ring. And again, you want to maximize that so the true negatives account for all of the negatives, the same way you want the true positives to account for all of the positives, and so on. Now, you can put numbers on all of these going from 0% to 100%, and the idea is to maximize each one as much as you can. So in sum, from these tables, we get 4 kinds of accuracy, and there's a different focus for each one, but the same overall goal. You want to identify the true positives and true negatives and avoid the false positives and false negatives. And this is one way of putting numbers on, an index really, on the accuracy of your measurement. Now, data sourcing may seem like a very quantitative topic, especially when we're talking about measurement, but I want to measure one important thing here, and that is the social context of measurement. The idea here really is that people are people, and they all have their own goals and they're going their own ways, and we all have our own thoughts and feelings that don't always coincide with each other, and this can affect measurement. And so, for instance, when you're trying to define your goals and you're trying to maximize them, you want to look at things like, for instance, the business model. An organization's business model, the way they conduct their business, the way they make their money, is tied to its identity and its reason to be. And if you make a recommendation that's contrary to their business model, that can actually be perceived as a threat to their core identity, and people tend to get freaked out in that situation. Also, restrictions. So for instance, there may be laws, policies, and common practices both organizationally and culturally that may limit the ways that goals can be met. Now, most of these make a lot of sense. So the idea is you can't just do anything you want. You need to have these constraints. And when you make your recommendations, maybe you'll work creatively in them as long as you're still behaving legally and ethically. But you do need to be aware of these constraints. Next is the environment. And the idea here is that competition occurs both between organizations. That company here is trying to reach a goal, but they're competing with company B over there. But probably even more significantly, there is competition within the organization. This is really a recognition of office politics, and that when you as a consultant make a recommendation based on your analysis, you need to understand you're kind of dropping a little football into the office, and things are going to further one person's career, maybe to the detriment of another. And in order for your recommendations to have the maximum effectiveness, they need to play out well in the office. That's something that you need to be aware of as you're making your recommendations. Finally, there's the issue of manipulation. And a sad truism about people is that any reward system at all, will be exploited, and people will generally game the system. This happens especially when you have a strong cutoff. You need to get at least 80% or you get fired. And people will do anything to make their numbers appear to be 80%. This happens an awful lot when you look at executive compensation systems. It looks a lot when you have very high stakes school testing. It happens in an enormous number of situations. And so you need to be aware of the risk of exploitation and gaming. Now, don't think then that all is lost. Don't give up. You can still do really wonderful assessment. You can get good metrics. Just be aware of these particular issues and be sensitive to them as you both conduct your research and as you make your recommendations. So, in sum, social factors affect goals, and they affect the way that you meet those goals. There are limits and consequences both on how you reach the goals and how really what the goals should be, and that when you're making advice on how to reach those goals, please be sensitive to how things play out with metrics and how people will adapt their behavior to meet the goals. That way, you can make something that's more likely to be implemented the way you meant and more likely to predict accurately what can happen with your goals.